It's such a great pleasure to welcome Joanne Glode to speak to the New England Botanical Society tonight. Joanne Glode holds a Bachelor of Science in Plant Biology from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. She also holds a Master of Science in Natural Resource Management from the University of New Hampshire, where her research focused on upland impacts to and buffers around salt marshes. Some of you may remember that Joanne started her career at the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, working as a natural community ecologist on the original Biomap team. Presently, Joanne is the Southern New Hampshire Stewardship Ecologist for the Nature Conservancy in New Hampshire, where she applies her background in natural resource management and plant ecology to managing 15 preserves totaling over 6,000 acres. Tonight, she joins us to talk about her recent work on the climate adaptation strategies for New Hampshire's salt marsh habitats. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Joanne.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you everyone for inviting me. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you guys today about the work that we're doing in New Hampshire, specifically around our salt marshes. Just to give you a quick outline about what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do like a super brief introduction to the Nature Conservancy. I don't know how many people on the call know who TNC is. I'm just going to assume you don't know who we are, and I'll give you a quick overview of who we are and the work we're doing in New Hampshire. And similarly, just a real brief overview of why we care about salt marshes and how they're particularly vulnerable to climate change. Then I want to dig into like 3 things we're working on in New Hampshire. A demonstration restoration project we did at one of our preserves. And I want to give an overview of an assessment we did of our tidal culverts. And then I want to with just kind of touching on some of the active projects that we have that are sort of projects still in the works that have sort of evolved from those other 2 projects that we previously worked on. Oh, good, my slides are moving now. All right, so the Nature Conservancy, it has the mission of conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. It's a big mission, but it's a big organization. We're in 72 countries, working on all around the world. And it was started in 1951 by scientists concerned about protecting rare plants, rare species, and ever since then it's been expanding. It expanded in size, it expanded in scope, and in the 1990s, they started really focusing on conservation planning and protecting biodiversity at scale. Then in the 2000s, the organization, the scope changed again, really bringing people into the solution, and diversifying strategies for protecting the environment beyond land protection, working on policy issues, community engagement, marine science, stuff like that. And so our work in New Hampshire, just is really diverse because it captures a lot of that different work that we're doing. We're working on protecting resilient and connected lands. We are very active in the marine and estuarine world, and we have a lot of folks working in the policy realm, particularly around green. But the backbone of our organization has really always been protection in New Hampshire. We have protected over 300,000 acres in the 60 years that we've been active there. Of that land, TNC has held on to 30,000 acres, and we manage those as preserves. So we have 31 preserves across the state. In my role as a Southern New Hampshire Stewardship Ecologist, I'm responsible for 15 of those. And for the rest of the talk, we're going to talk about the work that we're doing really in the coastal, seacoast area of New Hampshire. And particularly the work that we're doing with our partners on increasing coastal resilience, and really focused on our work in salt marshes there. So I really want to just touch on why we care about salt marshes and why we're doing this work. Salt marshes, for folks that do know, they just provide a lot of, they have a lot of services that they can do. They filter water, they capture a lot of nutrients and sediment. They are excellent at absorbing wave energy, and in doing so, they really can stabilize our shorelines and prevent a lot of erosion. They're really specialized they exist in a very specialized environmental conditions. And so they have a really diverse assemblage of specialized plants that have this awesome ability to capture and store carbon. And they create a really unique habitat that provides important wildlife habitat, supports biodiversity for wildlife and plants, and it's associated with a lot of rare and declining species, including the sharp-tailed salt marsh sparrow. And they're primary production powerhouses. They are really the nursery that supports our estuary and our offshore food web. And why do we care about salt marshes? What is the problem there? Well, they're particularly threatened by climate change, and that is because our sea level is rising. And they are an ecological system that is highly tied to the amount of flooding that happens on the marsh, the elevation within the marsh. And so any hydrologic change to the system can have an impact on. So for folks on the call who are familiar with salt marshes, you'll know there's really three distinct zones. There's the low marsh, which is the area of the marsh that gets flooded twice every day with the low tide. It's typically vegetated with Spartina alternate flora. Then we have the high marsh. This area doesn't get flooded quite as often, really just with the moon tides. The three species that are the most common in New Hampshire for the high marsh is Spartina patens, Disticus spicata, and Juncus gerardii. And then up at the upland edge, we have plants growing there that are the least salt tolerant, the least flood tolerant, and we have sort of a transition zone between the salt marsh vegetation and the upland vegetation. And so you can imagine with sea level rising and the hydrology here changing, how these zones in the salt marsh, are naturally going to need to change. But luckily, marshes have a natural ability to build in elevation themselves. They can capture sediment from the tide. So every time the tide comes in and floods them, so twice every day, it's coming in and bringing material onto the surface of that marsh, and it can capture that sediment and build that way. And then also, the peat can build as well every year. That peat is made up of roots, old root material, old leaves that just have a really limited opportunity to decompose because of the growing conditions, the conditions in that. They're really low oxygen, a lot of water in there. There's just not a lot of decomposition happening. So we know in Great Bay, so Great Bay is the estuary in New Hampshire, and we know that the salt marsh elevations there are increasing and they're changing. Their elevation gain is changing as sea level rise is also changing. And so we're lucky that we have Dr. Dave Burdick. He's a salt marsh scientist out of the University of New Hampshire. He's been studying salt marshes for decades in the Great Bay Estuary. And from his research, he's observed that, back in the 90s, we were getting about 1.7 millimeters a year of salt marsh elevation gain. And then more recently, coming into the 2000s, we're seeing that increasing to now we're up to 4.3 millimeters of elevation gain within the salt marsh itself. So our salt marshes are building in response to the sea level rising. And so that gives us some hope for the marshes in the Great Bay Estuary. And a big reason for this is that we have a very sediment-rich estuary. You can see this picture here shows this very sort of muddy, silty stream here. This is Lubberland Creek. And so there's a lot of sediment in the system. And so the marsh is able to capture a lot of that. But we're still concerned for future marsh loss. And that is because, the sea levels are continuing to rise. At some point, we're just going to see a lot of extra flooding on these marshes, which can result in the drowning of the marsh plants. And also we have tidal restrictions. There's barriers like roads and culverts that are preventing the full extent of the tide from coming in and covering our marshes and delivering that sediment to the marshes there. And then also we have, as everyone does in the coastal area, that we have barriers to migration. And so what we're referring to when we talk about marsh migration is that increase or the expansion landward of the salt water and the salt marsh, as the sea level is rising. And so in this photo, you can see, so actually, I don't know, I'm hoping you can see my cursor, but this low area in the photo you can see is like dark, low kind of vegetation. And this is a salt marsh. This is the salt marsh at Lubberland Creek that we're going to talk a lot more about in this presentation. And then this lighter colored, browner, sort of dead looking grass, senescent grass. This is an upland hayfield. And then these orange stakes that have been put up here are representing where this edge, this transition zone between the marsh and the upland edge would migrate to, given 6.3 feet of sea level rise, which is what we're anticipated to get in the next 100 years. And so this is something that there was a UNH class that would come here and do a lab every spring. And this was something that the professor would have them measure out and do, and they would use their clinometers and their measuring tapes, and they'd put these little stakes in, and then they'd stand back and they'd look at it and they'd talk about marsh migration. And you can see in this situation, because this is a nature preserve and it's managed as a field, here you can see there's nothing that's going to stop that marsh from kind of creeping up this slope and continuing to exist at this site. But, in a lot of situations around in these coastal areas, we have houses, we have roads, there's seawalls. And so that land, that space just does not exist. And so in cases like that, where we have a lot of coastal shoreline development or hardening, the marsh, as it's migrating up the slope, is just going to get sort of squeezed and shrink. And so they're calling that a coastal squeeze. So where those migration corridors exist, we're just going to see marsh loss potentially. So we're concerned about that. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk, is really, opportunities for improving marsh migration around the salt marshes in New Hampshire. And the first project I really want to talk to you guys about is a restoration project we worked on at our Lubberland Creek Preserve. Our Lubberland Creek Preserve is a Nature Conservancy owned and managed preserve in Newmarket and Durham, New Hampshire. It's 380 acres in size, and it includes a 55-acre salt marsh at the mouth of Lubberland Creek. And that marsh is the second largest salt marsh on the Great Bay Estuary. And it supports a breeding population of salt marsh sparrows and has 7 rare plant species. So going back into I think it was 2010, sometime around then, UNH climate scientists came out with really the first climate change projections for our region. And so it was the first time that we could really start to think about what it means for these tidal communities, with these projections in mind. And then also right around the same time, we were getting, for the first time, some really awesome LIDAR data for the watershed. And so we combined those two pieces of information, and we were able to see what could potentially happen to these salt marshes given sea level rise projections, like how these elevations could change and what might happen. So this is what we're looking at here is a map. This is the Lubberland Creek Salt Marsh. In green is showing you the 55-acre marsh that currently exists. And in brown, here, this is mudflat. And then the blue is the open water. So this is open water, even at low tide. So this is what it looks like right now. And then going forward with a 6.3 foot sea level rise, and not taking into account any of the marsh building that can happen. This was a pretty simple model. It's just a bathtub model. We just flooded it up 6.3 feet and saw what available habitat was left, for salt marsh to exist in, given the slope of the land. And what we saw was that we were really potentially, this is a worst case scenario, we could lose all of our marsh except for a fringe. And really what becomes quite important is the migration corridor, upslope and upstream into Lubberland Creek itself. We really were interested in this area up here, this area where it's still a little bit of green. We wanted to know what that looked like and could the marsh, actively move up there if it needed to. And so it really drew our attention right here to this road stream crossing where Bay Road crossed over Lubberland Creek. And we wanted to see, you know, what was there and can the tidal water, you know, get through there. And this is what we found. So we found a little squashed 36-inch culvert that was pretty high, you know, perched. And so the water was just kind of flowing off of it like a waterfall. Even at high tide, there really was very limited connection there between the water that was upslope and downstream from this road stream crossing. And then also what we found, you know, at the base of that culvert, you know, on the downstream side, so on the salty side, was in the water this dark black mass of spaghetti of baby eels. So elvers trying to make their way up from the estuary up into the freshwater habitat. So we recognized, you know, a couple pretty major ecological, you know, problems. And then, you know, in talking to the road agents and just sort of knowing the community, we knew that that in the springtime, this road flooded a lot when we would get heavy rains. And so so we knew there was also an issue here with the transportation, public safety, transportation reliability for the community here. So we talked to the town road agents, and we asked them how interested they would be in replacing this culvert, and, you know, whether it was a priority for them. And what we learned when we went to go talk to them was that this road is actually considered an evacuation route for this town, because they have a couple other connecting roads, but a lot of those are really historic roads that were built in like floodplains, and so those flood a lot as well. And this road was considered, you know, the higher, more reliably open road. But with all these, you know, more intense storms that we've been getting with our changing climate, this one spot was actively flooding. And so for them, it was actually a really high priority, and they really were excited when we came to them and asked for them to work with us to see if we could get this out of here and put in a better structure. So we worked with the town and we came up with some goals. The goals for the culvert replacement were to reconnect the stream for fish passage, to allow for salt marsh migration, to remove the risk of road flooding. And we knew whatever was going to be built, we wanted it to allow the passage of a 100-year flood event. Plus, we wanted to build it for the worst case sea level rise projections for the life of the structure that was being put in place. And so that was 75 years. So we worked with the town and we hired some engineers, and the engineers did hydrologic analyses and modeling. They provided this conceptual design and then helped us with the permitting. Oh, I gotta go back. So what they decided was necessary for the site was to increase from a 36-inch little round culvert to actually a 16-foot wide box culvert or bridge, and to raise the road elevation by 3 feet. And this is a picture of this is the town of Newmarket Public Works department staff, plus, you know, some extra folks that came in from this crane and the culvert company. They came in to install the base. And then because we were building this on these marine sediments that weren't very supportive of all the extra weight we were putting on here, we actually had to have the bottom like a closed bottom culvert, which we didn't really want to do. We didn't want to be this disruptive, but we had to for engineering purposes. And so we had to rebuild that and reconstruct the stream bed through this structure. But what it gave us an opportunity to do was I wanted to show the slide because it gave us an opportunity to build these little shelves on the side of the stream bed. So we built these little rocky shelves. And then after we built this, we put these little game cameras, wildlife cameras up. And what we saw was that we had created these little pathways, and now all this wildlife was using the culvert to come through the under the road instead of going over. So we were happy to see that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's the top. They put the top on. And that's what it looks like now. Well, a little more vegetated, because that was back in October 2019. That's when this culvert was installed. This was a $400,000 project. The funders were the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund, NOAA. We got a Coastal Resilience Fund. The town of Newmarket actually contributed a lot of money through their Public Works Department. A lot of it was through labor. And then we received a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Fish Passage Program fund as well. So all that combined allowed us to put this project together. And we've been doing monitoring. So we did some baseline monitoring, some before when the old culvert was in place, we did some monitoring there to sort of evaluate what the conditions were. And we've been doing them from 2019, and we're sort of committed to doing them until 2023 as a requirement of one of our funds. But I think we're going to continue doing them because it's interesting to see how this site is changing given climate change. But anyways, so back in 2015, we did fish and eel monitoring using a combination of different methods, seine nets, these big nets that we've sort of dragged through the wider portions of the creeks, minnow traps, and little sweep nets for collecting eels in the spring. And these two pictures really tell you all you need to know about how successful the project has been. The photo on the left shows you this is what sampling looked like downstream of the old culvert. So for the eels, we do these 10-second sweeps, so those sweep nets. And each one of those sweeps, we would just scoop up hundreds and hundreds of eels, and it would take us a long time of counting them as they were wiggling out of our nets, because they were just kind of swimming up and kind of bashing up against the edge of the road, and they couldn't go any further. So it was just this big barrier for them. And then with the new culvert in place, the photo on the right shows you a picture looking into the bucket there. And you can see one little eel, and you can see one little stickleback. That's what a 10-second sweep looks like now, which is awesome. Like, obviously, we're not seeing a ton of eels. And the reason why is because there's no reason for them to stop there. Like, they're just moving right on through. It's awesome. They're going right up into that freshwater habitat. We are seeing them in the upstream area. This graph on the left is showing you, this blue column is showing you here that pre-restoration with the old culvert in place, 100% of the eels, we were only ever seeing them downstream of the culvert. With the new culvert in place now, we're getting them both downstream, and the majority of them we're finding upstream. And same with the mummy chugs, with the old culvert in place, we were only finding them downstream of the culvert. With the new box culvert in place, where the mummy chugs, for those of you that don't know, that's a fish that is really characteristic of the salt marsh. It's a little tiny estuarine fish that is quite tolerant of a range of salinities, and now it's just kind of cruising throughout the system, which is fabulous. So we've been able to demonstrate that we really removed the barrier to fish movement here. And then, probably more interestingly to this crowd, I have to talk about the fish because I think it's fun, but is the vegetation monitoring that we've been doing out there as well. And so it has been, obviously we've got, some vegetation monitoring happening around the culvert, but we're looking at the whole marsh system. We've got permanent plots set up out there where we're looking at, we're identifying all the species in our plots, giving percent cover estimates, doing stem counts and heights, and we're also collecting pore water salinity information. And what we're looking for, what we're sort of expecting to see as we look at this data, is any evidence of marsh migration happening in the system. So we're really looking for changes in those transitional areas between the low marsh and the high marsh. That's what this picture here is showing. You can see the taller Spartina alterniflora in the low marsh, and then and the high marsh that's being sort of evaluated with that quadrat right now. And then also changes in the transitional area between the high marsh and the upland edge, where we might start to see, some of the high marsh vegetation kind of creeping up. We're also interested in how that ratio of maybe bare areas to vegetated surfaces might change over time. If we're seeing some of the vegetation dying with more flooding happening on the marsh. And then also just the ratio overall throughout the marsh of Spartina alterniflora, we're kind of expecting that it will increase, at sort of the expense of Spartina patens. And so I'm telling you what I'm expecting to see because we have only got 3 years of data. So I don't have any data results to share with you, but I have results from my colleagues at the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and Dr. Dave Burdick from UNH Jackson Estuarine Lab, who have been studying 3 other salt marshes in the system, and they have long-term salt marsh monitoring sites. So I'm going to show you right here. This is Lubberland Creek, if you can see my cursor. And so you can see how close it is to their 3 sites. They have one here in the southern part of the bay, Sandy Point, Great Bay Farms, and then up here, Bunker Creek. And they've been studying these since 2010. And we adopted their protocol at Lubberland Creek. And so the data we're collecting now is being fed into and shared with them. And so this data that I'm going to share with you is hot off the press. This was shared to me by Chris Peter, who is their chief scientist out of the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And what this is showing you is the results of their monitoring, so 10 years of monitoring of these sites. And what you can see, so for this particular site, this is Sandy Point, this big green wedge of the pie is Spartina alterniflora. And so this one has seen a decrease in that. This site has seen a decrease in Spartina alterniflora, but an increase in dead and bare. So there's more flooding happening, and unfortunately they're losing that low marsh. And that is in, I can't see the top of my slide, but I'm assuming that's those low marsh plots. That makes sense. In those transition areas between the low and the high, they're actually seeing more Spartina alterniflora coming in. And then in the high marsh itself, they're seeing, so what is this gray? The gray here is rack, so more rack, more Spartina alterniflora, and less Spartina patens. Yeah. So that's this one site. I wish I could see the top of my slides. So for this particular site, similarly, they're seeing a lot more bare and dead, but they're also seeing more Spartina alterniflora move in these transition areas. And that is at the expense, once again, of Spartina patens. You can see how that particular species has really declined. And then in the high marsh, what we were kind of expecting to see was more Spartina alterniflora coming in because the high marsh is getting flooded more, and that's exactly what they're seeing here. A real decrease. This light colored green is the Spartina patens. That's decreasing. And then at the upland edge, for this particular site, they're seeing a lot more brackish plants. So that's interesting. The salt marsh is creeping up. So I have one last site for you. This one is particularly wet. This one is really changing. So the transition plots here are really, there's a big increase in bare and dead as the site is just really getting flooded. The high marsh is really shrinking. There's a lot more dead and bare here, a lot less Spartina patens, a ton more Spartina alterniflora creeping in. And at that upland edge, really just a lot of dead happening there. So a lot of change happening in some of these salt marshes where we have the data too. So that's that. And what I wanted to close with, just talking about that project, is that if you're interested in learning more about what the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve is doing and their long-term data sets, there's 3 resources here. One is a report, one is a website, and one is an invitation to come to the research symposium that's happening on October 13th at the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And so I'm assuming you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint. So these links, hopefully you can just copy and paste them and sign up for that event if you want to join in. Because I want to move on and talk to you about a project that evolved from our Lubberland Creek demonstration site. So we were being asked, after we did that project, we were asked by a lot of towns and by the DES Coastal Program and, just by a lot of our partners, this is great, but where else can we do this work in the state? How else can we work together with communities to improve the resilience of the community, and then also improve the resilience of the ecological system. Like, this is exactly what the kind of work we need to be doing to make, to adapt to climate change. And so we were asked if we would take like a bigger look at all the tidal crossings in New Hampshire. So this was a project that was led by my colleague Pete Steckler and at the Nature Conservancy, and Kevin Lucy out of the DES New Hampshire Coastal Program. And we also worked really closely with UNH Jackson Estuarine Lab. And let's see. And so the goal was to assist transportation and coastal natural resource managers to maintain resilient tidal ecosystems and a safe and reliable transportation network. And what we were asked to do was to come up with a protocol for evaluating these tidal crossings. And it was based on field and GIS-based data collection, and then also creating from that a scoring and prioritization process. So we went out, we identified 118 crossings, and we went out to each one of those and evaluated them based on, these parameters. So firstly, we wanted to look at how safe and reliable the infrastructure was for the transportation itself. And so what we looked at was the, condition of the culvert. You can see here some pretty bad examples. There's a big hole in the road, and this one's like super corroded. So things like that we were looking for, and the reason for that was similar to our project in Newmarket. We wanted to, see if we could find sites where they were already probably areas that the towns would want to replace anyways, and if we could find places with deteriorating structures that also were sites that were where the ecological system was particularly, disconnected, that those were exactly the places that we wanted to work. We also looked for evidence of flooding. And so, in a lot of these coastal tidal areas, you can see rack lines, you can see high water marks. And we also talked to road agents, and we asked them, and DPW staff, and said, ask them about the history of flooding at these particular sites. So that was helpful. We collected longitudinal stream survey information so that we could quantify the amount of tidal restriction at each one of these crossings. We looked for evidence of tidal aquatic organism passage, like barriers. This is Lubberland Creek, so you already saw this one, but we looked for other examples of perched culverts, of reasons why critters couldn't fish couldn't swim through the streams. And then we used these SLAM models. So SLAM stands for sea level affecting marsh migration, and this is was a tool that, or a GIS layers that came out after we had done the Lubberland Creek project. So ours was a very simple model. This is a much more robust and involved modeling exercise that was done by once again our colleagues at the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and New Hampshire Fish and Game, that looked at salt marsh migration potential at a lot of the salt marshes throughout the state. And so we used that data set to see what the migration potential was at each one of these tidal crossing sites, but knowing that the full potential of that couldn't really be realized unless the hydrologic connection was there. And then lastly, we evaluated the natural community on either side of these structures. So you can see in this particular example, you've got this nice salt marsh here, and then there's two little culverts here and here. And the marsh on either side of these looks very different. And so that's a pretty unnatural natural community break. And so we were looking for to be able to determine the how continuous or how natural the natural community was on either side of the structure, and to give it a ranking on that. And so we ranked each site based on the information we gathered under those, looking at all those different things, and then we combined all those scores. And so the scores 1 and 2 represent culverts that are in pretty good shape, where the ecological system is also pretty intact. And then scores like 4 and 5, these orange and red, are really high priority sites that would be awesome to replace. And so our results identified 23 high priority culverts where the infrastructure is at risk and the ecological benefits are really great. And this one that you can see here highlighted as red is the project site I just showed you. And so obviously the evaluation that was done there was done with the old culvert in place. And so I'm happy to say that that little red dot has been turned green, but obviously there's a lot more work for us to do. And if you're interested in learning more about that particular project, you know, the Tidal culvert evaluation that we did, this report lives on the DES, New Hampshire DES website, and there's a link here. And then also all the data, it's on a data viewer that's online that's provided by New Hampshire Granite. And they have a coastal viewer that they make available on their website. And so you can just sort of zoom around in the map and pull up the culverts, and you can even pull up the SLAM, the salt migration models, and you can see how that relates to the culverts. So that's kind of a fun tool if you're interested in seeing that and digging into this a little bit more. So those links are for you. Yeah, and so just in closing, I wanted to mention a few projects that are in the works. So obviously I said there's a lot more work to do, and we are doing some of that work. And so what we have moved on with right now is the sort of beginning steps for getting the next 5 culverts replaced in these 5 high priority culverts that were identified from that report replaced. And so what we're doing right now is developing relationships with the tidal crossing owners. So we've got relationships established with these project partners, which include the New Hampshire Department of Transportation, the towns of Rye, the town of Northampton, Stratham, and Seabrook. And one of these projects also includes a salt marsh restoration component. And so we are working with, I think I have a picture of it. Oh yeah, I do. So this is the marsh that we'll be doing the restoration component on. This project's actually a little further along than the other one. So I said there was 5 projects in total. 4 of them are actually just in that conceptual design phase, so that we've got engineers working on trying to figure out what the structure should be. This one, the culvert has actually been replaced. And so what it's doing now is there's a lot more water like leaving the system, but you can see that this is a pretty impaired salt marsh because of having all this water on it for too long, and all the ditches, the historical agricultural ditches that are on the surface here. And so we're working now with Northeast Wetland Restoration, and they're putting together a restoration plan. And that's all stuff that's just kind of in the works. And if you're interested in knowing how this next round of tidal culvert replacements and this salt marsh restoration project, how it kind of pans out, you'll have to invite me back or invite back Jeff Wilson or one of my partners at the Research Reserve, and they'll be happy to kind of give you a phase 2 of this talk. But for now, I think I can open it up to questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joanne. And it's just so encouraging to learn about this kind of a collaborative approach to applied conservation work in our region. So I was wondering if you know whether the Nature Conservancy is working on any similar type of salt marsh resilience work in any of the surrounding states.
Yes, they are. And I feel like I should be prepared with a good answer for that, but I do know they are. Yeah. And I know they're doing a lot of like community resilience projects, working with towns, trying to identify where those projects are. I don't know if there's any active on the ground projects that are in the works, but I know there's a lot of planning that's being happening for sure.
And I was also curious about the fine filter conservation work that relates to these type of projects. Are there any specific efforts to seek out some of the rare plants of the salt marsh communities and really observe specifically how they may be migrating along with the more general changes in the habitat and natural community composition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like a lot of the monitoring right now is really just on the system as a whole, and it's not really fine-tuned to like the the rare plants that are there. So that's kind of a missing piece. And it's definitely something that we could be looking to, especially as we understand now that our marshes are, we've always sort of been under the impression that our marshes are building at a rate that's equal to sea level rise. And so like, oh, you know, they seem to be keeping up. I think we're okay. But we're starting to see evidence now that that's not the case. And so, yeah, looking more closely at some of those rare plants and seeing what they're doing as well is definitely seems like the next step. Yeah.
Great. More opportunity for great cross-organizational collaborations, perhaps.
Yes.
So we have a question from Jen. What was the timeline from start to finish for your Lubberland Creek Preserve?
Yeah, so we started, I think that was like back in 2015 was when we contracted with the engineers to do the hydrologic analysis and stuff. And then the finished product was in 2019. So it was about a 3-4 year project. Yeah.
Great. And similarly, from Jen, how were you able to get grant money for salt marshland, and is it owned by a group?
So
maybe how did you fund the project work as well?
Yeah, so the lands, so I feel like there's two questions there. How did, in terms of protecting the land itself, there's actually a partnership that's been very active in coastal New Hampshire since 1997. It's called the Great Bay Resource Protection Partnership, and it's 9 conservation organizations. Like it includes Nature Conservancy, but also like state agencies. You know, there's whole bunch of us, and we've all been sort of working collectively around common goals, protecting the habitats and the waterfalls. And we work together to apply for grants. And then with that grant money, we apply it to the highest priority lands. And we actually just updated our coastal conservation plan. And so that's what we use to kind of guide where the highest priority land conservation should be. We would like to see it happening in the watershed. And that's a tool that's online. But anyway, so that partnership has been active since 1997, and we've been getting a lot of money through NOAA and through other, you know, creative ways of pulling money in through grants. Largely, it's though through NOAA and from NACA. That's a source of funds that's supportive of habitat for migratory waterfowl. So we were getting a lot of NACA grants as well. And so, that's the land protection side of things. So that's how we protected a lot of the property. In terms of the project itself, there's a lot of interest in funding coastal resilience projects now, and so all of those ongoing culvert projects, and definitely the Lubberland Creek project was funded with NOAA coastal resilience funds. And so definitely working with NOAA and working with DES, your local DES, is a good way to learn about what those potential funds are for climate adaptation projects. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, and we have a question from Karen. Are you having any issues with Phragmites invasion in these systems? I would assume so, but your photos did not show that. Are there control efforts for this species as part of the projects?
Yeah, so totally. So at Lubberland Creek, we have no Phragmites. That's a site where we've been like really actively watching for it. And every time we find a little sprig, we pull it out. And so that's worked there. So it's been good. We're seeing a lot of cattail expansion there. So that I'm like not sure about that in terms of like migration, like if that's going to impact the salt marsh migration or not. That's kind of a question I have there, is around the cattails. But no Phragmites yet, luckily, knock on wood. The project that I was actually closed on by saying that we're doing some restoration there, that one has a lot of Phragmites, and it's all around the perimeter. And so that restoration plan includes a good amount of thinking and planning around how to make sure that the Phragmites doesn't expand there. And so we're going to be learning through that project as that begins, which will be next summer. And hopefully that'll be some learning that we can share with everyone. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Joanne. Another question from Jen. Have you seed saved and or propagated any of the species that you've seen decrease due to rising tides?
No, we haven't done any of that. No.
Okay. Great. Well, again, more opportunity for those partnerships for folks who are more perhaps focused inherently on the fine filter
Right.
aspects. But that's a great opportunity going forward. All right. From Karen, one of the models showed a housing subdivision partly within the projected future marsh if the crossing was improved. This creates a potential conflict with residents of these areas. Do you have an approach for addressing these conflicts? And have you had to deal with the situation on any of your projects yet?
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
question. So the project that I was telling you had the restoration component. That one has included a big component of community outreach and education. And it's interesting that that's, we've had to really invest in that and talking with the landowners and helping them to understand how, because obviously when you're talking about water and you're talking about water close to people's properties, they get very concerned about what might change. And so in that particular example, what's happening is the undersized culvert is actually full. So by increasing the size of the culvert, we were actually getting more water out and increasing the flood storage capacity of the marsh for that, when there is like a lot of fresh water in the system, so it doesn't back up. But it took a lot of community meetings and talks with landowners to sort of get them on to sort of understanding the hydrology of their system and for them to understand the risks. And there is a lot of development in areas that will get flooded with sea level rise, and so that's part of the conversation too, is like, yeah, unfortunately sea level rise is happening. So yeah.
Fantastic, Joanne. Well, those were the questions that we had in the chat, and we're coming in on an hour for this meeting. So it was an hour so well spent, Joanne. Thank you so much for describing this really interesting and important work. As we know, the climate is rapidly changing and the urgency of these kind of projects is so evident now. So thank you so much for being with us to share some of this really innovative work that you've been doing.